May 10th, 1905. At approximately 8:45 in the evening, Snyder, a small settlement in the southwestern part of Oklahoma Territory, which had not yet become a state. About 1,000 people lived there. The day was coming to an end. The streets were growing dark. Families were gathering inside their homes, and almost no one could imagine that within a matter of minutes, the Snyder they knew would cease to exist. Heavy clouds had been hanging to the southwest for some time. Lightning flashed now and then. From somewhere in the distance came a strange, low roar. Some people heard it long before the impact, but mistook it for an approaching hailstorm. This was an era without weather radar, satellites, or a modern warning system. People could judge danger only by the sky, rumors, and occasional telephone messages. And that is what made the evening so terrifying. The tornado was not completely without signs. The signs were already there, but almost no one understood what they meant. Today, meteorologists can reconstruct only the general picture of that day. Observations in 1905 were limited, and information about the upper atmosphere was almost non-existent. But surviving weather maps reveal a dangerous combination of conditions. An area of low pressure was developing over the western United States, while southerly winds had been carrying warm, moist air onto the plains for several days. Only 2 days earlier, a tornado had destroyed part of Marquette, Kansas, killing dozens of people. On May 9th, more tornadoes were reported across parts of the Central Plains. The atmosphere was already showing signs of extreme instability, but in Snyder, there was no one who could look at a radar screen and see a rotating thunderstorm approaching. There was no centralized system capable of rapidly warning an entire town. By evening, thunderstorms were forming over western Oklahoma. One of them produced a destructive tornado, and before it ever reached the lights of Snyder, it had already left shattered farms and dead residents behind. The first dangerous vortex appeared far to the southwest at approximately 6:45 in the evening. Later, the storm system produced another tornado that moved east and northeast along the Otter Creek Valley. Homes were swept from their foundations. Farms were reduced to debris scattered across fields. Several miles before the tornado reached Snyder, people had already been killed. But the town itself was still living through what seemed like an ordinary evening. At around 8 o'clock, residents noticed the approaching storm. This is where the story becomes especially disturbing. Many people never saw a familiar funnel. Darkness, rain, and hail concealed it, and the circulation itself may have been so broad that it did not resemble the narrow cone seen in modern photographs. Then heavy rain began, then hail, and then, almost suddenly, everything became quiet. A pause. A strange, dead silence after the violence of the storm. To the people of Snyder, it may have seemed that the worst had passed. In reality, the worst was standing almost directly at the edge of town. Moments later, the silence was torn apart by a sound survivors would later describe as continuous thunder, grinding, and crashing. There are reports that Snyder was warned by telephone from both the north and the south, but this was not a warning in the modern sense, not a single, clear alert reaching an entire population. Most eyewitness accounts suggest that there was almost no meaningful time to react. Some people heard the roar and ran for storm cellars. Others believed a severe hailstorm was arriving. Some simply did not have enough time to understand what was happening. The tornado entered Snyder from the southwest at approximately 8:45 in the evening. The timing was reconstructed in an almost symbolic way. Watches recovered from the debris had stopped near that minute, while a large clock inside a local drugstore was frozen at 8:43. The destructive path was roughly half a mile wide. Moving at several dozen miles per hour, the tornado may have needed less than 3 minutes to cross the town. At any single location, the most violent winds may have lasted less than a minute, but 1 minute was enough to erase entire blocks. The western side of Snyder was struck first. Then the tornado tore through the northern neighborhoods. Walls exploded apart, roofs vanished into the darkness, and wooden beams became airborne projectiles. Witnesses said the air was suddenly filled with debris. The tornado moved through residential areas where many people had already returned home after the working day. North of the railroad, almost no buildings remained standing. Nearly everything on the western and northern sides of Snyder was either destroyed or severely damaged. But then another threat emerged. The tornado had severed telephone and telegraph lines, cutting the town off from the outside world. Heavy rain followed the destruction, making it difficult to search for the injured. Fires broke out in the ruins, and the wind began carrying burning debris toward buildings that had survived. People who had only just crawled out from under wreckage now had to search for relatives, rescue the wounded, and prevent the flames from finishing what the tornado had started. In a matter of minutes, the disaster had become a survival of an entire community. This is the point where statistics stop being enough to explain what happened. The family of school superintendent Charles Hibbard tried to reach a storm cellar. His 12-year-old son was sent ahead to open the door. Hibbard himself slowed down to help his elderly parents and younger children. They never reached shelter. Only 2 of his sons survived. In another story, a young woman named Nina Fessenden was preparing to marry railroad engineer Clarence Donovan. For a simple, accidental reason, their wedding had been postponed until the following morning. Both were killed that night. Snyder resident Cal Williamson, in the confusion, grabbed a woman he believed was his young wife and carried her to safety. When the winds finally died down, he realized that he had rescued a stranger. He later found his own wife among the dead. There were far too many stories like these for a town of roughly 1,000 people. And in those first minutes, no one even knew how many people were still alive, or how much time remained to find them. Communication with the outside world was impossible. The telephone was dead. The telegraph was dead. So the only way to call for help was to send people. Several residents walked roughly 3 miles to Mountain Park. One of the first messengers was so shaken that people initially refused to believe him. Only when other survivors arrived and repeated the same story did the truth become clear. Snyder really had been devastated. From Mountain Park, word was sent farther, and neighboring towns began organizing special trains. Late that night, the first doctors, volunteers, and supplies arrived. Temporary hospitals were created inside buildings that had survived. Rescuers worked in darkness and rain, often searching almost by touch. Then dawn began to break, and only then could people see what had been impossible to comprehend during the night. Where hundreds of homes had stood the previous day, there were places where the view now stretched across almost open ground. A broad swath of destruction ran through several blocks. Even many buildings outside the main path had been damaged. The town had not simply been struck. Its physical structure had been torn apart. The exact death toll remains disputed to this day. The modern official tornado database lists 97 deaths and 58 injuries, but research by the National Weather Service suggests the true number of victims was probably higher. Historians have cited estimates of around 120 deaths across the wider series of related events, while reconstructions of the Snyder tornado itself suggest approximately 111 fatalities. The Oklahoma Historical Society gives a figure of 113 deaths. The reason for these differences is simple and grim. Some victims could not be identified with certainty. Travelers were present in town, and early newspaper lists were incomplete. The tornado was later retrospectively classified at the highest level, Category 5 on the Fujita scale. But perhaps the most important number is not the rating or even the final death toll. It is the amount of time. The destruction unfolded in only a few minutes. Snyder had been founded only a few years earlier, and in a single evening it nearly disappeared. Yet the town was rebuilt. Today, its story is a reminder that a warning is not a formality. Sometimes, The difference between an ordinary evening and a mass casualty disaster is only a few minutes of information. Minutes the people of Snyder barely had.